And we're going to continue with the 10th chapter of Many Waters by Madeleine L'Engle. Sandy, it turned out, was kidnapped by Tekela's family. He is in their tent. Tekela came in to feed him, tried to seduce him. He is not into that anymore at all, to the point where he called her a slut. Sometimes I will remove words when I'm reading. I did it in Sword in the Stone because the N-word was used in that book. Slut, though, because number one, because this book is written by a woman and is being said, by a 15-year-old boy to a girl that, although she is, 80 years older than him, is, mentally and physically the same age as him. It's forgivable in the context of the story. Agree or disagree, comment below. Anyway, I will continue from where we left off. How are they going to keep me here? What do they think they're going to get out of it? Noah's vineyards, she said. What? Noah's vineyards. They're the best on any oasis. That's idiotic. Noah wouldn't give up his vineyards. They're his livelihood. He'd better give them up, Tekela said, or they'll kill you. Sandy stood up, outraged, hitting his head against the roof skins. Do they know Grandfather Lamech is dying, is dead? Of course. They're monstrous. They're clever. They know everybody would be paying attention to the silly old Lamech and wouldn't miss you. They're very clever. Oh, no, they're not, Sandy said. No one gives in to terrorists. Noah won't give anybody his vineyards. Then they'll kill you. And what good will that do? They won't have the vineyards, and they'll have to have murder on their hands. Oh, Sand, sit down. This tent wasn't made for giants. I hate to tie you up again, but I have to, unless what? Come with me. What would your family think of that? They'd hate it, but I care more about you than I do about them. Sandy did not believe her. There was a trap here. This had something to do with the Nephilim, with that mosquito Rofocale. What he did not know. Tekela did not love him enough to be angry at her enough to anger her family. She did not love him at all, but she would obey Rofocale. He felt a sharp sting and slapped, but missed the mosquito, who buzzed out of the tent. Furious, he scratched at the bite. Tie me up and go away. She pressed her face close to his. You won't come with me? No. You'll risk being killed? His mouth twisted into a half grin. There are fates worse than death, and he laughed because Tekela did not have the faintest idea what he was talking about. I haven't bound you yet, she whispered. No. You're a giant. You could grab me and run off with me, and you could tell them you'll kill me. And if they try to capture you again, it was tempting. He shook his head, and a great wave of sadness washed over him. Tekela had never heard of the great heroes of lance and spear, of longbow and sword, but this was what she was tempting him to be, what he could be if he wanted to be. What in him was urging him to reject this attractive role? What was telling him to say no? It was more than his suspicion that this was all some kind of Nephil trap. The sadness washed over him again. Violence was no longer an option. The splitting of the atom had put an end to that, though the world was slow to realize it. Yes, he could overcome Tekela with ease. She was inviting him, but even if there was no trick in it, he would not do it. Violence met with violence produced only more violence. His stomach nodded. Are you sure? Tekela's voice had little whine in it. Of what? That you won't come with me? He smiled without mirth. There was poison in Tekela's offer, of that he was certain. No, Tekela, I won't come with you. Yes, to you I'm a giant, I'm young and strong, but then what? I couldn't survive in the desert. I've seen bones there, and not all of them are animal. She pouted. I thought you liked me. You're a delicious dish, Tekela. Now please bind me again, but perhaps you don't need to do it as tightly as before. She was offended. She tied the thongs as tightly as she could, with vicious little jerks, but Sandy used enough strength so that she did not succeed. Then she flounced out, slapping the tent flap closed behind her. He didn't mind the darkness. Enough light came in through the edges of the closed roof hole. He needed to think. He was extremely confused at his own reactions. He and Denny's had their fair share of fistfights when they were younger, though perhaps not as many as their sister Meg. They played mostly team games and did not go far in boxing or wrestling, and they did not go in for boxing or wrestling. Was he being a coward? He knew that Tigla's father and brother would not hesitate to use bow and arrow, stone knives, or spears. He knew they were quite capable of killing him, just as much if he ran away as if he stayed. In fact, he thought he had more chance of surviving if he stayed and figured out some way and route of escape than if he rushed out into the desert unthinking. He was not so much afraid as outraged. He did not think he was a coward. So what to do? Violence was not going to work. Violence was what these little men turned to, and he did not want to be like them. He wondered if they had gone to Noah with their wild demands for his vineyards. He did not know Noah as well as Denny's did, but he did not think Noah would give in. Sandy's rejection of violence had nothing to do with giving in. Anything but. After Grandfather Lamech was buried in the grave in the small cave, and the singing had died out, and the seraphim were gone, Noah and his family walked slowly toward the big tent. Wherever there was an outcropping, or rock, or a cave, Japheth, holding his tiny bow and darts, would hurry to look, Denny's on his heels. "I do not like this," Noah said. Denny's and Japheth returned from peering into the deep shadows of the little cave. The starlight was so bright that the shadows seemed to increase in darkness. Is Sandy lost in the desert? Denny's voice cracked more than usual in his anxiety. In the distance, they heard a howl. "Hungry!" Yaleth reached for Denny's hand and squeezed it. Shem said, "If the manticore is hungry, then he hasn't found anything to eat." Oholibama said, "Don't worry about the manticore. Sandy scared it away from Grandfather Lamech's tent." Could Sandy scare the manticore again if they met out in the desert? Denny's was not certain. Not after his own encounter with the ugly creature. Elishaba said, "Sandy would never have just wandered off on his own." Yaleth nodded. "He was following you to Grandfather Lamech's tent." Noah rubbed his beard. Yes, that's what we thought. But when he didn't come, then we thought he must have stayed in the big tent." Anna said, "Well, he didn't, and that's that. I think he's off with my sister Tigla. That's what I think." Nobody replied. The stars moved slowly across the sky. Denny's tried to listen for their singing, but he could hear nothing. After the glorious requiem for Grandfather Lamech, they were silent. The moon was dipping behind the horizon when they reached Noah's tents, tired, sorrowful, anxious. "Now, before anything else, all of us must eat," Matred said. Noah said, "She is right. Come, Den." Denny's accepted the bowl of broth Matred gave him. He knew that he needed all his strength for whatever lay ahead. With his strong teeth, Shem pulled the meat off a mutton bone. Elishaba handed him a bowl of broth. "Will you go look for sand?" Shem, the hunter, was the one who knew the oasis best. Japheth and Ham worked in the vineyards close to home. Shem was the one who should go, and Denny's flashed Elishaba a glance of gratitude. Absently, he passed Sela, who was leaning against him, putting her trunk on his knee. Absently, he patted Sela, who was leaning against him, putting her trunk on his knee. Shem saw that Denny's had finished his broth and nodded. He reached for one of the tall spears leaning against the inner wall of the tent, hefted it, offered it to Denny's. Denny's took it, though he had never used the spear. Shem checked his small quiver of blow darts, then reached for a second spear, and nodded at Denny's. Not speaking, the boy followed the short, stocky man out of the tent. Feeling a little hope, there was something about Shem that gave him confidence. Noah said, "Japheth and I will search the paths of the oasis." Ham said, "Anna and I will go to the marketplaces." Matred spoke too cheerfully, "And if Sand returns to the tent, which seems likely, we will let everybody know." Shem and Denny's pushed out of the tent flap. The stars were dimming. Light tinged the eastern horizon. Heat was already beginning to shimmer in watery mirages on the desert. Denny's had on one of Matred's woven hats and hoped it would be adequate once day broke. Shem looked at him. "Once the sun is high, you must go back to the tent." Denny's nodded. Shem, like Japheth, was right about that. Already his skin was prickling from heat as well as anxiety. He tried to keep himself from imagining what might have happened to his twin. He followed Shem. Followed. The heat bore down. The futile searching seemed interminable. After what must have been several hours, he asked, "Where's Higgaion?" Shem said, "He will spend the day mourning at Grandfather Lamech's grave. Then he will come to us. Sela will help lighten his grief." Higgaion scents for water, Denny said with sudden hope. Do you think he could scent for Sandy? Shem leaned on his spear, thinking, Mammoths are strange creatures. They can do strange things. Let us try. Shem strode off. He walked at a rapid pace, but Denny's, with his much longer legs, could easily have outstripped him, and had to hold himself back. Grandfather Lamech's burial cave was about halfway between his tent and Noah's, and the sun was rising by the time they reached it. Higgaion was stretched out on the sand, his fan-like ears lifted at the approaching footsteps. Denny's hurried to him. Higgy, do you think you could scent for Sandy the way you scent for water? The mammoth's little eyes had been shadowed with grief. Now they brightened. Shem dropped to his knees by Higgaion, bending down toward him in an intimate communication, speaking softly. The mammoth raised his trunk in a small, hopeful trumpet. Denny's eyes, too, were hopeful. Oh, Shem, what could have happened to him? Shem's voice was heavy. Some people are wicked, and the imagination of their hearts is only to do evil. What about Grandfather? Denny said. Shem stroked his beard in a gesture much like Noah's. Grandfather knew. There is much wickedness. It, too, smells. You do not smell wicked, Den, nor does the sand. Grandfather said that there is great warmth in your hearts, and that is a pleasing smell. It was the longest speech Shem had ever made. Thank you, Denny said. Then, let's go. Shem shook his head, glancing at the sun. I thought we would have found him by now. Come on, Denny's urged. Den, I have hunting to do if we are to eat tonight. But my sisters and their families ate hugely. Did you notice? Funeral baked meats, Denny thought angrily. Den, we must eat if we are to have strength for whatever. Denny's turned to Higgaion. Come on, Higgy. Den, I hunt best alone, but I will continue to search for the sand. Find Japheth, but he and Father will be searching near the tent. Do not go off with Higgaion alone. It is not safe. Denny's looked at Shem's anxious face. Not safe. Not safe. Because whatever had happened to Sandy might happen to Denny's. We will not stop until we find him, Shem said. Go find Japheth, you and Higgaion, and that is where we will pause.